A silent, suffocating tension descended upon the southern borderlands in the dead of night. The faint scent of diesel exhaust replaced the soft murmur of hopeful footsteps. Something fundamental had shifted, a tectonic change unseen by the world, but felt acutely by those running for their lives. A new order, cold and metallic, was being forged in the heart of the Americas. Mexico, the storied land of welcome, raised a barrier of iron at Washington's demanding request. The celebratory speeches in D.C. echoed with a chilling, self-congratulatory ring of success. They hailed the end of the chaos, oblivious to the desperate human flood now being rerouted into deeper, darker deserts. The Iron Fist strategy wasn't just a policy change, it was a definitive declaration of a hemisphere divided. Do you believe this approach is a necessary evil or a humanitarian disaster in the making? Comment your honest thoughts below and let your voice be heard. And if you want to understand the true, complex cost of this border deal, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. The policy change, activated with the stealth of a midnight military operation, was immediately palpable along the vast, sweeping length of Mexico's territory. It was not a subtle bureaucratic adjustment, but a sudden, massive deployment of the National Guard, turning key migrant transit points, rail yards, bus stations, and main highways into zones of rigorous, uncompromising scrutiny. The very air along the train tracks, once humming with clandestine movement and quiet desperation, became heavy, thick with the silence of fear and the pervasive presence of uniformed authority. In Washington, D.C., the reaction was almost euphoric. A collective sigh of relief emanating from political offices facing increasing public pressure. Administration officials, wary of the looming election cycle and the endless, politically damaging images of crowded border sectors, quickly stepped forward to praise the unprecedented level of cooperation achieved with their southern neighbor. They described the success with calculated metrics. A rapid drop in daily encounters at the U.S.-Mexico frontier, a statistic treated as irrefutable evidence of the strategy's immediate, almost miraculous efficacy in staunching the flow. Yet this celebration of lowered numbers felt hollow to those watching the true ground reality. The political victory merely masking a humanitarian calamity that was merely displaced, not solved. The National Guard, a force initially intended for public security, now executed explicit immigration mandates with a severe, methodical efficiency, turning back thousands who had already traveled for months. Their presence was a cold, impenetrable wall, a psychological barrier that crushed hope long before a physical barrier could ever be erected. The immediate consequence of this iron fist was the creation of vast, unyielding bottlenecks in Mexico's southern states, particularly around transit hubs near the Guatemalan border. Migrants who once relied on the relative anonymity of northbound freight trains, a journey known as La Bestia, were suddenly cut off, the train cars guarded with an intimidating level of military presence, their paths blocked by razor wire and stern-faced soldiers. This sudden blockade left tens of thousands stranded in sweltering, under-resourced cities like Tapachula, transforming these communities into accidental, overcrowded waiting rooms of endless uncertainty. The air in those makeshift camps was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, desperation, and the ever-present humidity that clung to every tattered piece of clothing. Children's cries mixed with the low, frustrated murmurs of their parents. Individuals who had sold everything they owned for this one, final chance at a life free from endemic gang violence or inescapable economic ruin. Their journey had not been stopped. It had simply been forced off the main roads, pushed into the shadows where danger multiplies and the rule of law completely vanishes, supplanted by the harsh governance of criminal organizations. This shift was a gold rush for the cartels and human smugglers, the very same criminal networks the Iron Fist strategy was ostensibly designed to combat. By eliminating the relatively easier path on the trains, the Mexican government inadvertently raised the price of passage and centralized the control of human traffic into the hands of the most ruthless operators. Smugglers known as coyotes quickly adapted, demanding exorbitant fees to navigate the newly enforced routes through remote, treacherous jungle paths or over dangerous mountain terrain, exploiting the desperation of those with nowhere else to turn. The financial transaction was not just for passage. It was for a precarious, temporary shield against the Mexican authorities, a bribe that bought a fleeting sense of security. The migrants, already financially destitute, were now plunged deeper into debt bondage, becoming even more vulnerable to exploitation, kidnapping, and human trafficking. Their very existence rendered collateral in a complex, deadly game played between two governments and transnational crime syndicates. This dark commerce flourished in the new vacuum of legitimate transit. The celebratory rhetoric from Washington conveniently overlooked this growing, palpable shadow economy and the sheer, brutal physical reality of the revised journey. It ignored the scorching daytime sun beating down on exposed skin, the relentless swarm of mosquitoes, and the constant nagging fear that every approaching vehicle or distant sound might signal the arrival of either a corrupt official or a violent gang member. The policy successfully achieved lower border numbers, but only by exporting the humanitarian crisis deep into Mexican territory. Looking back, this strategy is not an anomaly, but the latest, most aggressive chapter in a long history of geopolitical pressure that frames Mexico as a subordinate partner in U.S. border security. For decades, the U.S. has effectively externalized its border control responsibilities, using a mixture of diplomatic leverage, economic incentives, and veiled threats to ensure compliance with its own internal security concerns. The current Iron Fist is the heavy-handed result of this persistent, decades-long American foreign policy goal. The key to this enduring pressure lies in the massive volume of trade and investment that ties the two nations together, a leverage point Washington knows how to wield with clinical precision. Threatening tariffs, slowing border commerce, or freezing security aid often proves far more effective than any military deployment in convincing Mexican officials to dramatically increase their enforcement efforts. This dynamic means that Mexico's immigration policy often reflects the political climate in Washington, D.C., more than the social or economic needs of its own citizens or the rights of those passing through its land. When a U.S. presidential election looms, or when political pressure peaks due to high border crossings, the Mexican government reliably tightens the screws, often sacrificing its own resources and principles to appease its powerful northern neighbor. It is a transactional relationship where the cost of noncompliance, economic and political isolations, perceived as far greater than the domestic price paid for acting as the United States border guard, leading to a foreign policy-driven cyclical tightening and loosening of control. This historical context explains the speed and severity of the current crackdown. It is a high-stakes pre-election maneuver designed to provide the incumbent U.S. administration with a tangible, measurable, political talking point. The White House gets to claim a massive reduction in crossings, validating their diplomatic strategy, while Mexico avoids economic reprisal and maintains a facade of regional stability, an arrangement that both sides understand is inherently cynical and temporary, serving political cycles rather than sustainable policy goals. Yet, even as the two governments tout their momentary success, experts are already warning about the inevitable failure of an enforcement-only model and the dangerous unintended consequences. The Iron Fist strategy is intrinsically unstable, resembling the pushing down of a large water balloon. Pressure in one area only causes bulges and unpredictable shifts elsewhere, creating new, often more dangerous pathways for migration that are harder to track and control. The simple human impulse to seek safety and opportunity cannot be contained by military checkpoints. One immediate consequence is the rise of maritime migration routes, particularly along the Pacific and Gulf coasts, where smugglers are now loading desperate individuals onto rickety, overcrowded fishing boats or repurposed cargo vessels. This shift bypasses the heavily monitored land checkpoints, but introduces far greater risks, as these poorly maintained vessels face unpredictable weather, open sea hazards, and a higher likelihood of deadly capsizing, exchanging the threat of detention for the threat of drowning in the churning ocean waves. Furthermore, the strategy strains Mexico's National Guard, diverting resources and manpower from crucial domestic security and infrastructure tasks, which could ultimately lead to internal instability and a decreased capacity to combat organized crime in other regions. This over-reliance on the military for civilian law enforcement duties erodes the very distinction between the two roles, threatening the nation's democratic institutions and fostering an environment of fear and mistrust among the civilian population, creating long-term social costs. The most critical long-term failure, however, lies in the avoidance of the fundamental, systemic root causes driving the migration crisis from Central and South America. As long as countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and Venezuela remain crippled by political corruption, ecological disaster, and pervasive gang violence, as long as the economic disparity with the U.S. remains, a Gulf people will continue to walk, regardless of the level of enforcement they face. The Iron Fist merely punishes the symptom, guaranteeing that the cause will continue to ferment and produce new waves of travelers. The celebration in Washington is thus premature, resting on a foundation of temporary statistics and exported suffering, a momentary calm before the next inevitable surge. The migrant networks, the coyotes, and the cartels are dynamic and resourceful, constantly studying the checkpoints, mapping the new enforcement patterns, and identifying the weak points in the seemingly impenetrable armor. They treat the new policy as a challenge, an operational puzzle to be solved, already plotting the next evasion strategy, which will invariably involve a higher degree of risk for the migrants themselves. The sheer scale of the human endeavor, the determined will of families to cross multiple countries for a better life, is a force that history has repeatedly shown cannot be permanently stopped by walls or military patrols. It is a powerful current of economic necessity and basic human survival instinct that will always find a way around, under, or through the most sophisticated defenses. The silence currently reigning on the border is deceptive, the kind of silence that precedes a massive storm, not the end of a long, troubled journey. The true, lasting solution demands investment, development, and a diplomatic commitment to stabilizing the source nations, a focus that is costly and politically complex, and therefore consistently overlooked in favor of the cheap, quick fix of enforcement. The Iron Fist strategy is the easy, visible answer to a problem that requires a difficult, hidden, and sustainable commitment to long-term regional development. Washington may celebrate the political breathing room it has bought, but the debt for this peace is being paid in human lives and the erosion of international legal norms. The desert paths, now being utilized as desperate alternatives, whispered terrible new tales of abandonment and death. The shift away from established routes means fewer eyes, fewer journalists. Fewer humanitarian workers are watching, making the tragedy even more acute and easier to ignore. These remote stretches of arid land, once avoided for their sheer inhospitality, are now the main arteries of a clandestine migration flow, their unforgiving landscape claiming victims far from the political spotlight and the celebratory press conferences. This dangerous decentralization of the migration flow is a profound ethical challenge for both the U.S. and Mexico, forcing both nations to grapple with the moral implications of their collaboration. The Iron Fist strategy has made the journey demonstrably more lethal, a fact that both governments must tacitly acknowledge in their pursuit of border security metrics. They have chosen a path of deterrence through increased mortality and danger, a calculus that stands in stark opposition to the principles of human rights and dignity that both nations officially espouse on the global stage. The political theater of the border is highly manipulative, using imagery of order and control to generate public approval, while deliberately obscuring the chaos and suffering just beyond the camera's frame. The immediate success, heralded in congressional hearings and presidential briefings, is a mirage constructed from the misery of the displaced, a temporary reprieve purchased at the expense of the most vulnerable in the hemisphere. The applause for the Iron Fist strategy should be met with deep skepticism. The current situation is merely a pressure cooker, not a permanent seal, and the next explosion of migration will be fueled by the increased desperation and trauma accumulated during this period of severe restriction. The accumulated human need does not dissipate, it only gains a more explosive potential. The U.S. and Mexico are building a reservoir of political and social tension, one that could breach its banks at any moment, creating a crisis far worse than the manageable, predictable flow that existed before this heavy-handed intervention. The historical echo is loud. Every time a government tries to solve a complex social issue with pure force, the result is always a greater, more intractable problem down the line. The current strategy is a geopolitical expediency, a politically motivated firewall that guarantees short-term political gains for U.S. leaders. But the consequence is the empowerment of criminal networks, the humanitarian crisis in Mexican transit zones, and the moral cost will linger and poison the relationship between the two nations for years to come. As the deployment continues and the surveillance sharpens, the question remains, when will the U.S., in its self-congratulatory fervor, recognize the profound, self-defeating nature of celebrating a strategy that simply shifts the location of human suffering and hands more power to the cartels? The answer, tragically, is likely not until the next, more severe surge forces a reluctant reckoning. The Iron Fist, while effective in the immediate political sense, is a historical dead end, a monument to a failure of empathy and long-term vision in the realm of international affairs. The scent of dry dust and despair along the new clandestine paths tells the real story, far away from the polished briefing rooms and the triumphant, sterile figures. The border crisis is not a flow of numbers. It is a tapestry of individual lives, each one now bearing the indelible scar of a policy designed to make their journey impossibly, fatally difficult. And until that human reality dictates policy, rather than political calculation, the celebration will remain a hollow, shameful sound, echoing across the vast and troubled landscapes of North America. The very infrastructure of deterrence, celebrated in Washington, has become a silent partner to the world's most dangerous criminal enterprises. Every checkpoint, every blockade, every armed patrol that Mexico activates, inadvertently forces migrants into the waiting, predatory hands of human smugglers, whose fees skyrocket and whose methods grow crueler with every successful deterrent measure. The money that should be funding aid and development is instead funneling billions into the coffers of transnational criminal organizations, empowering them further. This cycle is the central, tragic paradox of the Iron Fist. It aims for control but achieves the opposite, decentralizing crime and increasing the volatility of the entire border region. The political benefit for the U.S. the ability to claim border security. Victu is directly proportional to the increased danger and despair inflicted upon the people seeking asylum and economic stability. It is a Faustian bargain, trading long-term regional stability for short-term domestic political peace. The celebration in Washington is ultimately a celebration of deflection, a victory not over the problem of migration, but over the optics of it, by ensuring the crisis remains far from the U.S. border television cameras. The administration buys itself the luxury of ignoring the core issues: the failing states in Central America, the catastrophic impact of climate change on small farms, and the unchecked spread of gang terror. The Iron Fist is a curtain drawn to hide the truth. And what of Mexico's internal political calculus? The government there, facing its own domestic pressures and a powerful northern neighbor, views the strategy as a necessary evil to maintain economic life support. The alternative, a border closed to trade, punitive tariffs, is a national economic disaster that supersedes any internal humanitarian concerns about migrant rights. Mexico, in this arrangement, acts as a sovereign nation stripped of its policy autonomy on one of the most vital national issues. The sheer physical exhaustion of the journey, compounded by the new obstacles, is visible in the vacant eyes of the stranded families. They are not invaders, they are survivors, pushed to the limits of human endurance by forces beyond their control. The sensory details of their wait, the persistent, gnawing hunger, the thin layer of dust coating every possession, the paralyzing fear of the next military sweep are the true, uncounted costs of the celebrated strategy. The long-term geopolitical forecast is grim, a hemisphere of two halves, one celebrating its insulation, the other buckling under the weight of its own enforcement. This strategy guarantees a perpetual low-intensity conflict along the Mexican transit routes, a drain on both countries' resources, and a permanent source of ethical controversy. The Iron Fist is a temporary spike on a seismograph that will inevitably show a larger quake is coming. The political leaders celebrating the metrics should be forced to stand on the train tracks near Oaxaca, feeling the oppressive heat, hearing the distant, mournful whistle of a train they cannot board, and smelling the desperation of those left behind. Only then, when the sterile numbers are replaced by the rich, terrifying reality of the human experience, will the true, profound failure of this heavy-handed solution become inescapably clear. The silence on the U.S. border is loud with suffering elsewhere. The narrative of success is a fragile construct, vulnerable to the next geopolitical tremor, major coup, a devastating hurricane, a new economic collapse that will push a fresh, overwhelming wave of people north. When that happens, the celebrated Iron Fist will shatter, exposing the fundamental flaw of an enforcement-only approach, and forcing both nations back to the table with a far more complex and violent crisis than the one they thought they had solved. This policy is merely a delay of execution.